Okay, now we're going to talk about the Great Depression, which lasted from 1929 to 1939. So, how stocks work. Stock is a piece of a company, and the price is the value of a percentage of the company, which would be a limited liability of a corporation. For example, $1 million company with 1 million shares equals $1 for each share. And if that company is worth up to $2 million, then each share is worth $2. If a company was making profits or had good future sales, the stock prices rise and everything's good. Stock prices fall when companies' earnings drop because warehouses filled up because the lack of new customers for durable goods. Speculation is when buyers bet that the market would continue to climb and they would make money quick, basically buying stocks above the worth of the company to get a quick return or profit. Well, the bull market lasted only as long as investors continued to put new money into the market. Plus, the economy based on durable goods. So, once you have a refrigerator, you don't really need one for like several more years to decades. By 1929, the market was running out of new customers. New customers could have been Europeans, but thanks to the tariffs, not happening. So, September 1929, professional investors saw no new customers and they started to sell off their holdings. Joseph Kennedy, yes, the father of John F. Kennedy, made money off prohibition and then he pulled money out when he overheard shoeshiners playing the same stock market he had his millions in. Prices started to slip, other investors followed, and the prices fell further, which ultimately became a domino effect. So on October 21st, 1929, the stock market plunged. On October 24th, the stock market plummeted even further. October 29th is known as Black Tuesday. The prices took the steepest dive yet, a 33% drop. The stock market lost $10 to $15 billion in value. $30 billion overall was lost. 30 billion equaled the total wages earned in 1929. These are images of the stock market crash. You see Wall Street in a panic as stocks crashed, Black Tuesday, just horrible situation. So business was booming, but investments were made through buying stocks on credit. You have an uneven distribution of wealth, over speculation of monetary returns on investments, large number of small investors, panic of selling off stocks, which led to the collapse of the stock market, excessive expansion of credit, business failures led to bankruptcies, bank deposits had been invested in the market, and then when the market collapsed, the banks ran out of money. The stock market crash signaled the beginning of the Great Depression. Some people panicked and withdrew their money from banks. A lot of people couldn't get their money because the banks had invested it in the stock market, and it ultimately led to financial ruin for a lot of individuals, some even committing suicide. In 1929, about 600 banks closed, and by 1933, about 11,000 of the nation's 25,000 banks failed. Millions of people lost their entire life savings, and there were generally no new investments made. This is an image of a bank run, people trying to get into the bank to get their money. As for causes of the Great Depression, we have overproduction of industrial and agricultural products. We have purchasing items on credit, which is pretty unstable. We have the unequal distribution of wealth, so between the richest Americans and the poorest Americans. We have an agricultural depression that had been plaguing farmers throughout the 1920s. The Federal Reserve failed to prevent this widespread collapse. And then we have these high protective tariffs where everybody's just creating tariffs to piss each other off. Impacts included unemployment, homelessness, bank closings, decline in demand, political unrest, farms foreclosing, people moving from rural areas to urban areas in search of jobs. Herbert Hoover, the president at the time, believed that prosperity would return to the country soon. He believed in laissez-faire economics, remember, government hands off. He encouraged businesses not to cut their wages, unions not to strike, and private charities to increase their efforts for the needy and the jobless. He cut taxes and created public works projects like the Hoover Dam. He created the Hawley-Smoot tariff, or he signed the Hawley-Smoot tariff, which set a tax from 31% to 49% on foreign imports. So European countries then placed higher tariffs of their own against the US in retaliation, which froze trade basically. Nobody was trading with each other. There was a debt moratorium where all international debts were suspended in 1931. Germany and Britain were like, hey, we like this. We don't want to pay our debts. France didn't like it because they were further ahead on their debts. The Federal Farm Board was authorized to help farmers stabilize their prices, but it really wasn't big enough to help overall. And the Reconstruction Finance Corporation was a measure to prop up railroads, banks, life insurance companies, other financial institutions, but really it only helped the rich and stuff didn't trickle down to smaller businesses. This is where you have trickle down economics, which I'm sure you've heard about in your economics classes. In the cities, people lost their jobs, they were kicked out of their homes, they ended up in the streets, sleeping in parks, sewer pipes, wrapping themselves in newspaper to keep warm. A lot of people built makeshift homes from scraps. These were known as shanty towns, and they were often also called Hoovervilles because people were pretty pissed at Herbert Hoover. Soup kitchens offered free or very low cost food, and bread lines offered free food provided by charitable organizations. So you can see images here of a soup line and basically shanty towns where people had these makeshift homes created out of scraps of trash. You can see images here of a soup kitchen and a guy who wants a job. Farmers were also hit really hard by the Depression, but an advantage that farmers had is they could grow food for their own families. A lot of farmers lost their land because of debt and falling prices. 400,000 farms were lost to foreclosure in 3 years. Farmers then turned to tenant farming to survive. You can see these images of farmers who have lost their homes. As for the Great Depression, many would walk the streets daily looking for work. 300,000 hobos wandered the country. They hitched rides on railroad cars. They slept under bridges. They developed their own hidden language in order to help them cope as they wandered, which you can see on the right there is a lot of their drawings. So riding the rails, this is what it generally looked like. When the railroad cars slowed down, people would hop into the boxcars to try and have a shelter to sleep in, live in. Farmers banded together to stop the banks from foreclosing on farms and kicking people out of their homes. The Farm Holiday Association attempted to reverse the drop in prices by stopping the entire crop of grain harvest in 1932 from reaching the market. That effort collapsed. The bonus march was when 1,000 unemployed World War I veterans marched to DC to demand immediate payment of their bonuses. Congress failed to pass the bill, and General Douglas MacArthur, yes, World War II Douglas MacArthur, used tanks and tear gas to destroy the protest group and drive them away from Washington. A lot of people saw President Hoover as heartless and uncaring thanks to this. A drought hit in the early 1930s in the Great Plains, and the land was overall exhausted. It was so dry, land became unsuitable for farming, and windstorms scattered the topsoil, leaving only sand and gravel behind. In 1934, a windstorm carried the dust hundreds of miles over to the East Coast cities. Regions hit the hardest by the Dust Bowl were Kansas, Oklahoma, Texas, New Mexico, Colorado. You can see on the map there the hardest hit areas. This is an image of a dust storm coming through. It would get through the cracks, it would get through everything. Thousands of farmers and sharecroppers left the area and packed up their families and headed west, following Route 66 to California. A lot of these migrants became known as Okies, but now it became really a negative term. They found work as farmhands, and by the end of the 1930s, thousands of farm families had moved to California and other Pacific states. John Steinbeck wrote about the hardships of Okies in his novel, The Grapes of Wrath. Americans believed in traditional values and they emphasized the importance of family even throughout the Depression. Many families with money so tight stayed home to entertain themselves. They played board games. Monopoly is a prime example. They listened to the radio. Movies provided an escape from Depression era realities if people could afford them. And sometimes families did break apart under the strain of trying to make ends meet. On the left, you can see the original Monopoly concept. On the right is obviously what we know it as today. As for women, there were added pressures placed on the family as unemployed fathers looked for work. Income decline, presenting severe challenges for mothers in feeding and clothing children. Women sought work, but then they were accused of taking jobs from men. Shocker. Even though they didn't get the heavy factory jobs. And most men didn't look for the types of jobs that were available for women. Crazy. And as always, women received lower pay than men. As for African Americans, racial discrimination continued. Basically, the policy of last hired, first fired was followed most places. Black sharecroppers were forced off their land in the South because of cutbacks in farm production. African Americans were excluded from state and local relief programs. Lynchings, of course, continued. And there was very little support from President Roosevelt for African Americans because he didn't want to lose white Southern Democratic votes. In the election of 1932, the Democrats put up New York Governor Franklin D. Roosevelt, who pledged a new deal for the American people, the repeal of prohibition, giving aid to the unemployed, and cuts in government spending. The Republicans, in voters' minds, the only real issue was the Depression and which candidate could do a better job of ending the hard times. Herbert Hoover was their candidate. Almost 60% of them concluded that it was time for a change. The Roosevelt-Garner ticket carried all but 6 states, Republican strongholds in the Northeast. Desperate for change, many socialists deserted their candidate, Norman Thomas, to support Roosevelt. Not only was the new president a Democrat, but both houses of Congress had large Democratic majorities as well. Hoover became a lame duck president. As for the 20th Amendment, which was passed in February 1933, it shortened the period between the presidential election and the inauguration and set the start of each president's term for January 20th, which is what it is today. So on the left, you can see Herbert Hoover and the man who succeeded him, which was Franklin Delano Roosevelt.